The study of archaeology is surprisingly ancient. For example, the son of Ramesses II, Prince Khamwaset, maybe, is often referred to as the first Egyptologist because of his work in restoring and identifying ancient Egyptian monuments. And this was taking place in the 13th century BC. However, while archaeology in some form has existed since ancient times, it wasn't until the mid to late 1800s that it was refined into a careful scientific endeavor. From the medieval period until that shift to a scientific method, archaeology was generally just carried out by antiquarians. Some antiquarians were scholars, but most were just rich dudes who wanted cool old shit for their personal collections. Their efforts were less about preservation and more about finding the most beautiful ancient pieces of art that they could get their hands on. They essentially were just glorified treasure hunters who focused on finding the most beautiful and potentially expensive artifacts and pieces of artwork that they could find, discarding or destroying the more mundane items that would actually help historians understand the lives of past civilizations. Given that, it's no surprise that many of these earlier archaeologists employed some pretty terrible methodologies that permanently erased valuable knowledge about the past from the face of the earth. Let's look at some of them, shall we? Jacques de Morgan. Jean-Jacques de Morgan was born in France. He was he, with a name like that? No way. In 1857, the son of a geologist, Jacques also took an interest in geology, as well as studying entomology and prehistory. But it was as a mining engineer that he initially made a name for himself, particularly for his work with tin mines. However, he maintained an interest in ancient history and prehistory, and this led Jacques to travel to Persia in the 1890s. His goal was to retrace the routes used by the Assyrian campaigns in Elam, though he did get distracted a bit after discovering huge petroleum reserves that he felt could be profitable. Eventually, Jacques arrived at the small village of Shush, located near the ruins of the ancient city of Susa. Susa had been the capital of Elam for over 2,000 years, after which it spent another couple of centuries as the winter capital of the First Persian Empire. Atop a hill surrounded by cattle ruins, Jacques discovered some old flints and pieces of ceramic. Realizing this might be of archaeological interest, Jacques contacted Gabriel de Mortillet, curator of the Museum of National Antiquities in Saint-Germain, who he had already been acquainted with through his father. Susa had already been the site of a British excavation in the 1850s and a French one in the 1880s, but clearly some things had been missed. France was eager to establish a monopoly on archaeological research in Persia, so they cut a deal with the Persian government for Jacques to lead excavations at the location. As Jacques saw it, though, there was just one problem with all of this. The castles that had formerly stood in Susa were in ruins, so there was no suitable base of operations for himself and his team. The logical solution would have been to take up lodging in the village of Shush, or perhaps to build temporary residences nearby. And if you thought either of those seemed like a reasonable solution, clearly you were not born into the French aristocracy. Jacques ordered the construction of Shush Castle, a castle built atop the very site they planned on excavating. And that sounds like a disruptive and time-consuming project, but they were able to shortcut the process quite a bit. After all, it's not like they had to transport a bunch of freshly cut stone to the location, not knowing there's loads of that shit already lying about. Shush Castle was built by dismantling and reassembling the ruins of Darius the Great's Apadana Palace and the Shurga Zanbil ziggurats of ancient Elam. This would serve as a base of operations for French archaeologists all the way until World War I, and all they had to do to build it was mutilate the existing ruins. To be fair, the excavations in Susa did result in a number of major historical finds, most notably the Victory Stele of Naram Sin from the 23rd century BC. In 2015, Susa was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. While this was done to preserve Susa in general rather than the castle Jacques built, the castle is now ironically protected from the exact sorts of activities that led to it being built in the first place. Heinrich Schliemann. Heinrich Schliemann wasn't like most antiquarians. While they were typically born into wealth, Heinrich was born into poverty in Neubachau in Germany in 1822. His mother died when he was just a child, so his father sent him to stay with his uncle, who was a pastor. He attended school until he was 14, but the family was too poor to send him to university. Instead, he became an apprentice grocer, working for 5 years before he injured himself from too much heavy lifting. Following that, Heinrich became a cabin boy on a boat bound for Venezuela. Just 12 days into the voyage, the boat was destroyed at sea, and he and the other survivors washed up in the Netherlands, so he just stayed in Amsterdam for a few years, working his way up from being a messenger boy to becoming a representative for an import-export firm. In 1850, Heinrich learned that his brother Ludwig had died, but not before becoming extremely wealthy in the California gold rush. He left for California and used the inheritance from his brother to start a bank in Sacramento, buying and selling gold dust. However, when complaints started to come in that the gold dust he sold them came in underweight, he went back to Germany, sold off his American business, and then moved to Russia. Heinrich used the money that he'd made to live the high life, making wealthy friends and then marrying the wealthy niece of one of those wealthy friends. From there, he became a profiteer, cornering the market in saltpeter, sulfur, and lead, and then selling them to the Russian government, who needed those items to make ammunition for the Crimean War. After selling off all of his reserves, Heinrich had made enough money to retire at the age of 36. This left him with time and money to pursue his true passion, the lost city of Troy. This was where Heinrich was actually different from most antiquarians of the day. As we mentioned earlier, they were predominantly treasure hunters searching for artifacts to either increase their personal wealth or fill out the British Museum. But Heinrich wasn't after riches. He wanted to prove the historicity of Homer's Troy, as it appeared in the Odyssey and the Iliad. Heinrich identified what he believed to be the location of Troy, located in modern-day Hisarlik in Turkey. The site had previously been excavated once already, and Heinrich's initial examinations left him pretty unimpressed. But a local expert, who also happened to own the land that Heinrich would be digging on, convinced him to keep on going. This time, however, Heinrich decided to take a bit more of a forceful approach. He dug a trench 17 meters or 56 feet deep, revealing 9 buried cities. Unfortunately, creating this trench was done with absolutely no care for what they were digging through, to the point that Heinrich heavily employed the use of dynamite to get the trench completed. While he did successfully find the ancient city of Troy, Heinrich also blew up a large portion of it in the process. The aggressive digging and explosions also disrupted and shifted some amount of the remaining ruins, ruining the timeline that a more careful excavation would have preserved. Arthur Evans. Sir Arthur John Evans was born in 1851 into a wealthy and well-connected family. His father, John, had made a fortune thanks to the family's paper mill business. The business had actually been founded by John's uncle, but John became a partner in the company after marrying his uncle's daughter, which is to say his first cousin. Past everybody. But John's reputation wasn't built purely on family fortune. He was also a well-respected scholar of geology, archaeology, and numismatics. That's the study of currency, by the way, the more you know. John was even knighted in 1892 for his work as an antiquarian, with his personal collection totaling over 12,000 artifacts. While Arthur did inherit his father's interest in archaeology and ancient artifacts, it seems he may not have been so lucky when it came to intelligence. In a letter written by Arthur's grandmother, she referred to him as being a bit of a dunce, particularly compared to his father. He was still able to attend Brasenose College, part of the University of Oxford, and graduated in 1874 with a first-class degree that he very much did not earn. Arthur was supposed to be studying modern history, but he ignored all of his university work to pursue matters of ancient history instead. Despite failing his exams, the school was convinced to give him a degree anyway, in large part because of his father's social standing. After graduation, Arthur traveled around the Balkans. Part of this was for networking and scholarly research, but he also wanted to act as a spy in the revolutionary upheaval that was taking place. When he returned to England, he became a journalist for the Manchester Guardian. Initially, he wrote about his experience in the Balkans, and then he became a correspondent in the region. This career ended in 1882 after he was arrested as an agent provocateur for writing anti-Austro-Hungarian propaganda. Though he wasn't convicted, he was sent back to England, and he became a keeper of the Ashmolean Museum, which was in the process of converting from a natural history museum to an art and archaeology museum. For years, he remained the museum's keeper while also traveling the world with his wife to explore archaeological sites. Following her death, however, he fell into a deep depression. Before his wife's death, he'd purchased some ancient stones at a flea market with unidentified writing on them, so he decided to travel to Crete, where he believed the writing may have originated. A couple of decades earlier, a Cretan archaeologist, Minos Kalakanios, had begun excavations of a Bronze Age palace on the island. In 1900, Arthur undertook extensive excavations on the site, revealing what he claimed to be evidence of the Minoan civilization. The palace had a maze-like quality to it, so Arthur believed this had been the palace of King Minos and home to the Minotaur of Greek myth. This belief was reinforced by the discovery of frescoes on the palace walls depicting bulls and some other bull-related artwork. But there was a huge problem for Arthur. The palace, originally constructed around 1900 BC and destroyed around 1350 BC, was in ruins. You might understandably be thinking that this sort of thing is to be expected in archaeology. The remains of an ancient palace that have been destroyed and buried underground for centuries was obviously going to be in rough shape. Sure, the wooded supports were rotted away and the palace was being held up by surrounding rubble, but that's just how it goes sometimes, right? Well, Arthur disagreed. The palace was currently in shambles, but what if it wasn't? What if he could restore it to its former glory by rebuilding the damaged and rotting parts of the palace using steel-reinforced concrete? Chances are that already sounds like a bad idea, but it's one thing to perform careful restoration of ancient sites using contemporary methods, but rebuilding it with modern materials and techniques is quite a bit different. Also, Arthur wasn't basing his reconstruction on evidence of how the palace had originally looked. Much of it was just based on vibes. He added pieces to the construction that had not originally been there, redesigned things that were there, and repainted the palace in colors of his choosing. Entire frescoes were added pretty much entirely by the imaginations of Arthur and his painters. Some of the paintings had been preserved well enough that they could be restored, at least somewhat faithfully, but many were so damaged that there was little to no original work to base the new paintings on. Although much of the history of the palace was irreparably destroyed thanks to Arthur's decision to renovate the building, he has remained a popular figure in the area for bringing attention and tourism to Crete. He is also credited with discovering the writing systems Linear A and Linear B in tablets found during the excavation, though examples of Linear B had been seen prior to this. Thomas Bruce, 7th Earl of Elgin. Thomas Bruce of the formerly Royal House of Bruce was born in 1766. His older brother died at the age of 7, making Thomas the new male heir and thus the 7th Earl of Elgin. He received the sort of education one might expect of a nobleman, followed by a brief military career. Although Thomas's time in the Scots Guard was limited, he continued to receive honorary military ranks by virtue of being part of the aristocracy, eventually rising all the way to Lieutenant General in 1812. Following his actual time in the military, Thomas was elected as a Scottish representative peer for the House of Lords in 1790. He remained a member of Parliament for 17 years, though he was rarely able to attend Parliament due to his other professional duties. In 1791, he became a temporary ambassador to Austria while the permanent ambassador was sick. He then was sent as the ambassador in Brussels until the French conquest of the region. Thomas then served as ambassador to Prussia for a few years before becoming the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1798. Now, so far, nothing in his life would have indicated that Thomas would have any interest in archaeology. Although he was certainly rich, he didn't share the lust for treasure hunting that defined a typical antiquarian. But what Thomas did have was an embassy that he felt would look a lot cooler if it had a bunch of ancient Greek artwork in it. This decision was prompted by a discussion with archaeologist and fellow diplomat Sir William Hamilton, though the idea still seems to have originated with Thomas. Anyway, in the summer of 1800, Thomas dispatched several skilled draftsmen, modelers, and the renowned painter Lucieri to Athens, and the original plan wasn't anything too crazy. At his own expense, Thomas had hired these men to make paintings of the ancient monuments and create plaster molds of sculptures and artifacts. His stated goal was to make his embassy beneficial to the progress of the fine arts in Great Britain. At the time, there was nothing wrong with any of this. The paintings were obviously fine, and plaster molds were relatively common back then, though we now know how damaging they can be to the original pieces. Regardless, none of this was really out of the ordinary. However, late in the summer of 1801, over a year after this project had begun, Thomas presented a royal decree allegedly from the central government of the Ottoman Empire, who controlled Athens at the time. According to the document he presented, not only was Thomas allowed to make casts of the sculptures, but he could remove any stones or sculptures that he wanted. What followed was an unrepentant looting of Athens. Dozens of ancient sculptures and artifacts were taken, including a marble throne. When it was time to send the first shipment back to Great Britain, Thomas's brig became shipwrecked during rough weather. All of the crew members were saved, but the cargo sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean. After 2 years, most of it was recovered, and it was eventually sent on its way to England, where it was put on display in the British Museum. Because of course it was. Even at the time, this was highly controversial, though. Many around the world, including in Great Britain, decried Thomas's acts as nothing but vandalism and theft. Lord Byron even wrote a poem about how awful Thomas's actions were. There was also the matter of the decree Thomas had produced to justify this theft. While the British Museum has the Italian translation made by Thomas's embassy, no official copy of this alleged edict has ever been found. Almost as if it was all just a lie. The British government did purchase the stolen goods from the Ottoman Empire in 1816 for £35,000, less than half of what Thomas spent acquiring them, but Britain's ownership of the Elgin marbles remains highly controversial and is disputed by Greece. Giovanni Battista Belzoni. Giovanni Battista Belzoni was born in Padua in Italy in 1778. He was the son of a barber and one of 14 children. He moved to Rome at the age of 16 and studied hydraulics, though his initial plan was to join a monastery. The French invasion of Rome put an end to those plans, though, so in 1800 he moved to the Batavian Republic, now the Netherlands, where he became a barber like his father. It's said that he fled to England in 1803 to avoid going to prison, though it's unclear exactly what charges he was facing. Some sources describe him as a sort of political agitator, while others say that it was legal troubles over debts and financial disputes. Regardless, he moved to England, where he married an Englishwoman named Sarah Bain. Being a barber wasn't cutting it in England, though, so Giovanni made the only logical career choice for a 6'7" man in the early 1800s. He became a strongman in the traveling circus. This lasted for about 10 years, with Giovanni and his wife traveling around England and much of Europe. In 1815, he left the circus and traveled to Malta, where he met a diplomatic emissary of Muhammad Ali, the de facto ruler of Egypt. Muhammad was working on agricultural reclamation projects for Egypt, so Giovanni traveled there to demonstrate a hydraulic machine he had created that he believed could raise the waters of the Nile for irrigation. The machine worked, but Muhammad ultimately did not go ahead with the project. Once again, Giovanni found himself unemployed in a new country, so he met with the British consul to Egypt, Henry Salt. Seeing what a big, strong man Giovanni was, Henry sent him to the Temple of Ramesses II to go and fetch a 7.25-ton bust of Ramesses so that it could be shipped back to, wait for it, the British Museum. Thus began Giovanni's career as an archaeologist. While he did make a number of important archaeological discoveries, his career was largely defined by brute force rather than scholarly precision. Temple doors were opened with battering rams, fixtures were ripped off walls with crowbars, and massive holes were broken into walls to allow Giovanni and his team to pull large sculptures and sarcophagi through. When he became the first person in modern times to discover the interior of the temple of Abu Simbel, he and his companions carved their names into the wall of the ancient structure like graffiti. Admittedly, that last bit was shockingly common at the time, though. Early archaeologists didn't have much of a concept of preservation, as evidenced by everything else we talked about today. So it was really all just about personal glory and fame. Archaeologists would carve their names into structures to show that they were the first person to discover it, ensuring their place in history. Although Giovanni's contributions to the British Museum were enormous, so too was the damage he did to Egyptian temples. But while he may have caused irreparable damage to the history of the ancient locations, at least any future generations who visit Abu Simbel will know that Giovanni was here. Thank you for watching.